The hidden hurt of growing up without emotional safety. There are wounds that never bleed. They grow quietly, beneath the surface of childhood, shaping the way a person learns to breathe, to trust, to love. Emotional safety is simple in definition, but profound in impact. It is the feeling of being allowed to exist without fear, to speak without trembling, to feel without apology. And yet, so many grow up in homes where silence is safer than truth, where emotions become landmines, and where a child learns to shrink before they learn to understand themselves. This is the story of that hidden hurt, the pain that hides behind competence, humor, perfection, or detachment. A quiet ache carried into adulthood, often unnoticed, but always felt. A wound shaped by the things that were said, and the many things that weren't. Before a child learns the meaning of words, they learn the meaning of atmosphere. Long before they can speak, they can sense. And somewhere in those early unspoken years, a kind of quiet ache begins. It does not announce itself. It does not crash or shout. It forms slowly, like a shadow settling at the edges of a room. Children feel the world through the nervous system first, through the rise and fall of voices, through the tension in a parent's shoulders, through the way footsteps sound in the hallway. Safety for a child is not a concept. It is a vibration. And when that vibration is shaky or cold or unpredictable, the child does something miraculous and heartbreaking at the same time. They adjust. They become watchful. They learn to scan a room before entering it. They begin to measure every expression, every pause, every sigh. They turn themselves into small emotional antennae, trying to sense what is coming next. Because in a home without emotional safety, the rules are never written, but they are always understood. A child feels that certain feelings are unwelcome, that certain truths are dangerous, that certain questions become storms, and so they learn to hold themselves carefully as if their own emotions are fragile glass that must not be dropped. At first, this vigilance feels like love, trying to keep the peace, trying to avoid making things worse, trying to be good, quiet, or easy to handle. But over time, this becomes something deeper, a rewiring of the inner world. They learn to smile when frightened. They learn to stay silent when uncomfortable. They learn to disappear emotionally, even while standing in the same room. This is the first quiet ache. The moment a child decides, without knowing they are deciding, that who they naturally are is somehow too much, too messy, too dangerous for the environment they live in. The ache deepens in the small moments. A slamming door, a sigh of irritation, a parent lost in their own storms, a mocking comment, a sudden coldness after a moment of warmth. Children remember patterns, not scenes. Their bodies remember the tension long before their minds understand its shape. And so the child begins to shrink themselves, just a little at first, then more, until shrinking becomes a personality, not a moment. They become careful with their joy, because excitement might be too loud. They become cautious with their sadness, because crying might be too much. They begin to edit themselves before anyone else has the chance. What begins as survival slowly becomes identity. Some children become quiet observers, the ones who stay in the background, learning to predict the household weather like a small, frightened meteorologist. Some become achievers, thinking that if they can just be good enough, perfect enough, unproblematic enough, then maybe love will finally feel soft. Some become comedians, hiding fear behind laughter. Some become caretakers, soothing the adults who were supposed to soothe them. All of this begins long before memory solidifies. The wound is not a single event, it is accumulated atmosphere. And the child does not think, "I'm unsafe." They think, "Something is wrong with me." Because children do not blame the environment. They blame themselves. It is the only thing they can control. This first quiet ache shapes everything that comes after. It becomes the blueprint for how relationships feel, how closeness feels, how vulnerability feels. It becomes the invisible script whispering underneath every future connection. Be careful. Stay small. Do not disturb anything. Love is fragile. Emotions are dangerous. Safety is uncertain. And yet, from the outside, no one may notice. The child may seem calm, mature, easy, low maintenance. But inside, something essential is missing. The sense that it is safe to be fully human. This chapter is the beginning of that story. The earliest bruise, the quiet shaping, the unnoticed wound that follows a person into adulthood long after the origin has been forgotten. The roots of emotional insecurity are often invisible. They grow silently beneath the surface, twisting into places too deep to be noticed, until they begin to shape everything that comes after. The beginning of the wound lies not in one single moment, but in a pattern that repeats itself across years. In homes where emotional safety is absent, the cracks are formed slowly, almost imperceptibly. The child does not know they are building the foundation of their emotional world, but they are. It starts with inconsistency, with the parent who is warm and loving one moment and distant or cold the next. It is the mother who reassures, then withdraws. The father who is engaged, then disappears into silence. The caregivers who mean well but are not attuned to the child's emotional needs. The good enough parent who tries but never quite understands. Children do not know how to manage this uncertainty. They only know that they feel a deep sense of unease, an unsettling, invisible force that tells them they cannot fully rely on the people who are supposed to be their emotional anchor. At first, it is small, a word not spoken, a look not returned, a promise not kept. But over time, the absence of emotional safety becomes a suffocating weight. The child learns to expect the unexpected, to brace themselves for the sudden shift, the emotional storm that can come at any moment. The roots of this pain often lie in unspoken emotional rules. There are no clear instructions, but there are expectations. Do not cry. Do not ask for too much. Do not be weak. Do not demand love. Do not speak your truth. In a home where emotional safety is absent, there are unspoken codes that dictate how emotions must be managed and how they must be hidden. The child learns these rules quickly. They begin to hold their feelings in check, locking them away in small, secret places. They become experts at hiding their vulnerability, learning to smile through their discomfort, to keep the tears hidden behind a carefully constructed mask. And sometimes, it is not what is done that creates the wound, but what is not done. The absent parent who is physically present but emotionally unavailable. The neglect that comes not in the form of abandonment, but in the form of silence. The child grows in a home where the emotional world of the caregivers remains closed, and so they learn that they must manage their own world alone. These early experiences, whether they involve emotional neglect, verbal criticism, or a simple lack of attunement, create the blueprint for how the child will perceive their worth and their safety. In the absence of emotional attunement, the child learns to shrink themselves in order to survive. This survival mode becomes internalized. It becomes an unconscious pattern that plays out for years, if not for a lifetime. The child who learns that their emotions are unsafe grows into an adult who still feels the invisible pressure. A deep-rooted need to hold everything in, to protect themselves from the world they learned not to trust. The foundation of emotional insecurity is not built in a single event, but in the cumulative effect of small, repeated moments of disconnection. These moments form a deep psychological pattern. A belief that their emotional world is too much, too unwelcome, too dangerous. The ache becomes embedded in the nervous system itself. The body learns to brace for the emotional turbulence that may come at any moment. The brain rewires itself to stay alert, to stay prepared. It becomes a constant dance of anticipation, waiting for the next emotional storm, waiting for the next subtle shift. What began as small moments of neglect or emotional volatility grows into something much larger. It becomes a foundational wound, a quiet thread that ties the child to a future filled with anxiety, uncertainty, and a deep, insatiable need for emotional safety that can never quite be fulfilled. And yet, for many, this story is never told. The child grows up, and the patterns continue to form without recognition. On the surface, everything may appear fine. The person may seem functional, calm, and collected. But underneath, there is a quiet, unspoken ache that no one can see. This chapter traces the origins of that ache, how emotional neglect, inconsistency, and unspoken rules combine to create an invisible wound. It is not the storm itself, but the subtle buildup of the winds, the stillness before the turbulence, that creates the emotional foundation of a life yet to be fully understood. Emotional safety is not a luxury. It is a fundamental need, a necessity for healthy development. It is the quiet soil in which trust, self-worth, and emotional resilience grow. Without it, a person is left to navigate a world that feels unreliable, uncertain, and often unsafe. To understand the depth of this need, we must turn to the science, the subtle rhythms of the human body, mind, and brain that are finely tuned to emotional safety. From the moment of birth, a child's survival depends on their ability to bond with caregivers. These early attachments are not just emotional, they are biological. The body responds to emotional safety with calm. When a child feels safe in the presence of a caregiver, their heart rate slows, their breath deepens, their nervous system regulates. The child is able to explore the world with confidence, knowing that they can return to safety at any time. This process, known as attunement, is the emotional synchronization between parent and child. It is when a caregiver is present, not just physically, but emotionally, responding to the child's needs, understanding their cues, and providing comfort. When attunement is present, the child feels seen, heard, and understood. But what happens when this attunement is broken? When a caregiver is emotionally unavailable, inconsistent, or unresponsive? The child learns to adapt. But these adaptations are not healthy. They are survival strategies. The first survival strategy is hypervigilance. When emotional safety is absent, the nervous system becomes on high alert. The child learns to read every subtle shift in tone, body language, and facial expression. They become experts at detecting the slightest change, the smallest sign of danger. This constant state of vigilance wears the body down over time, creating an undercurrent of anxiety that never truly leaves. The second survival strategy is emotional suppression. When feelings are consistently rejected, dismissed, or ignored, the child learns to disconnect from their emotions. They become experts at burying their feelings deep within, hiding them behind a mask of calm, never allowing themselves to feel too much, because feeling is too risky. The body, however, still carries the emotional weight. The feelings are never truly gone, just locked away in a place that can never truly heal. The third strategy is dissociation, a psychological coping mechanism where the person disconnects from their emotional reality entirely. The child who has learned that emotions lead to rejection or punishment learns to live in their head, disconnected from their body, emotionally absent from their own life. This is the emotional numbness that many carry into adulthood, the constant feeling of being detached, adrift in their own world. In the absence of emotional safety, the brain's stress response system becomes chronically activated. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, HPA, axis, which governs our stress response, is thrown out of balance. The cortisol levels remain high. The body is in a constant state of fight or flight, even when there is no real threat. This is the anxiety that never quite settles, the fear that lingers even when things seem fine. The long-term effects of growing up without emotional safety are far-reaching. They can manifest as attachment disorders, where a person finds it difficult to form healthy, trusting relationships. They may develop anxiety, depression, or an array of other mental health struggles, as the brain and body struggle to make sense of a world that has never truly felt safe. But it's not just the mind and body that are affected. The emotional pain of growing up without safety shapes the very way a person sees themselves. They begin to believe that they are not worthy of emotional safety, that their feelings are too much, that they are unlovable or unworthy of care. This internalized belief becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as the person pushes others away or chooses relationships that reinforce their fears. In adulthood, these patterns often manifest in relationships that mimic the emotional instability of childhood. The person who never felt safe may find themselves drawn to partners or friends who are emotionally unavailable, unpredictable, or critical, because this is the pattern they know, the pattern that feels familiar. They may also struggle with intimacy, finding it difficult to trust others or to be vulnerable because vulnerability feels too dangerous. Understanding the psychology of safety means understanding that emotional security is not just an abstract idea. It is woven into the very fabric of our biological, emotional, and psychological systems. When that safety is absent, the effects are not just felt in the heart, but in the very way the body operates, the way the mind thinks, and the way the self is constructed. Emotional safety is the foundation upon which everything else is built. Without it, we are left trying to build a life on unstable ground. And while the effects of emotional neglect may be invisible to the outside world, they leave a mark that can last a lifetime. Inside, there is a war. A quiet, unspoken conflict between the desire for connection and the fear of it. It is the voice that says, "I want love, but I don't know how to accept it." It is the longing for closeness, but the instinct to pull away. It is the desire to be seen, but the terror of being too vulnerable. It is the push and pull that defines the inner world of someone who has never felt emotionally safe. This inner split is not a choice. It is the result of years of emotional conditioning, of learning that love and trust are fragile things, and that being open can lead to rejection, abandonment, or worse. It is the part of the self that has been taught to hide, to be careful, to retreat. On the outside, this split is invisible. The person may seem calm, collected, even accomplished. They may navigate relationships with ease, presenting a picture of stability. But beneath the surface, the internal battle rages. The core of this split lies in the deep, quiet fear that their true self is too much, too emotional, too needy, too overwhelming. This fear is not always conscious. It often lies hidden in the body, in the tightening of the chest, the clenching of the jaw, the restless thoughts that flicker at night. It is the quiet panic that rises when intimacy gets too close, when someone starts to see through the walls that have been so carefully built. The person who has never felt safe as a child learns to become a master of emotional suppression. They learn to smile even when their heart is heavy, to laugh even when they feel alone. They become experts at compartmentalizing, pushing their emotions into neat, contained boxes, only to deal with them later, if at all. But the emotions never stay neatly packed away. They simmer under the surface, and when they rise, they do so with a quiet vengeance. This suppression leads to a profound disconnect. The person who has learned to hide their emotions also learns to hide themselves. They begin to live in their head, detached from the body, detached from their own feelings. They become hyper-rational, overthinking everything, constantly analyzing their actions. their words, and the words of others. But while the mind is busy analyzing, the heart remains hungry. The soul remains starved for connection, for authenticity, for the kind of love that comes without conditions, without fear. This inner split is not just about relationships with others, it is about the relationship with oneself. The person who has never felt safe often feels disconnected from their own emotions, their own desires, their own needs. They cannot fully know themselves because they have been taught that parts of themselves are not safe to feel or express. This self-rejection is deep, woven into the very fabric of their being. It is the voice that says, "You are too much. You don't deserve love. You are not enough as you are." And so they hide. They become a version of themselves that is acceptable, a version that is quiet, controlled, perfect. But this version is not real. It is a mask. The conflict is always there. It is in every desire for closeness, every longing to be understood, and every time they pull away from the possibility of being truly known. The person may yearn for emotional intimacy, but when it arrives, they do not know how to accept it. They are so accustomed to emotional distance that intimacy feels like a threat. They sabotage relationships, not out of malice, but out of self-protection. When someone gets too close, they push them away, fearing that being seen too fully will lead to rejection. They fear that their emotional needs will be too much to handle, that they will be abandoned again. The irony of this inner split is that the person longs for what they fear most: a love that is unconditional, a connection that is safe. They want to feel seen and understood, but they do not know how to let themselves be seen. And so, the conflict persists. It is a battle between the desire to be loved and the fear that love will hurt. A battle between the longing for connection and the instinct to protect. This inner split is not a simple dichotomy. It is the story of survival. The person has learned to protect themselves by becoming emotionally unavailable, but this protection also leaves them emotionally isolated. They crave closeness, but cannot allow themselves to receive it. They long for safety, but cannot trust that it will be offered. And so they live in a world that is both full and empty, full of desire, but empty of fulfillment. The ache of this inner split is one that is never fully resolved, but it is also the first step toward healing. Because in recognizing this conflict, the person begins to see the walls they have built around their heart. And in seeing those walls, there is the possibility of taking them down. There comes a moment, sometimes small, sometimes seismic, when something finally breaks open. It is not always a dramatic collapse, not always a burst of tears or a loud confrontation. Sometimes it is a quiet unraveling, a shift that goes unnoticed by others but is deeply felt within. This is the moment when the weight of all those hidden wounds, all the unacknowledged fears, all the emotional suppression that has been held in place for years, finally comes to the surface. It may happen in a conversation that feels different, a quiet moment of honesty that suddenly feels like a spark in the dark. Something shifts. The truth begins to crack through the walls that have been built so carefully. And in that moment, there is no longer any hiding. It is as if the body and the mind, after years of holding on to tension, finally exhale. The body, which has spent a lifetime in hypervigilance, finally begins to soften. The chest that has been tight with anxiety, the throat that has been choked with words left unsaid, begin to release. It is a small, unsteady sigh at first, a whisper that says, "I can breathe." This moment is not an instant transformation. It is the slow realization that something is wrong, that something has been wrong for far too long. The person may not even know exactly what it is yet, but they begin to feel it, the ache of something unhealed, the residue of years spent hiding. Often this moment is triggered by a relationship, a conversation, a moment of intimacy, or even an argument that forces the walls to crack. Perhaps it is a question asked in earnest, a moment of vulnerability from someone they trust. And in that moment, something inside shifts. But the shift is not always comfortable. It is painful, even excruciating at times, because it means facing the things that have been buried. It means confronting the quiet belief that their emotions, their needs, their desires are not allowed to exist freely in the world. The internal walls, the ones that have been erected for protection, begin to crumble. And in their place, there is an emptiness that feels both terrifying and liberating. It is the silence before healing begins, the place where the wound is exposed but has not yet begun to heal. This is the point where the realization begins to sink in. The pain that has lingered for so long is not the fault of others, but the result of years of emotional neglect, misunderstanding, and suppression. It is a truth that, once acknowledged, can never be ignored again. It is the first step toward healing, but it is also a moment of deep grief. Because in realizing the extent of the emotional damage, there is also the painful recognition of what has been lost. The childhood moments that were never safe, the love that was never fully received, the connection that was never fully felt. The person begins to understand the depth of the wound, but they also begin to understand themselves in a new light. They see the survival strategies they developed, the emotional walls they built to protect themselves, and they begin to question the story they have been telling themselves. The story that says, "I am too much. I am unworthy of love. I must remain small to survive." In this moment, there is both a sense of loss and liberation. Loss, because the truth is painful to bear. Liberation, because the truth finally brings the possibility of healing. For the first time, the person can begin to imagine a life where they are free from the chains of emotional suppression, where they are no longer bound by the belief that their emotions are too much to handle, where they can be seen fully and authentically. This is the moment where something finally begins to shift, where the person begins to understand that their wounds do not define them and that it is possible to rebuild their sense of emotional safety, but only by acknowledging the hurt that has been hidden for so long. It is not a dramatic transformation. It is a slow, often painful realization. But it is the beginning of something new, something that is not about fixing or erasing the past, but about learning to be whole again, learning to trust in the possibility of emotional safety. And so the walls that have been built over the years begin to come down, slowly, carefully, but with a growing sense of possibility. The person starts to see that they are not too much, not unworthy, not broken. They are simply human. This moment, when the first cracks begin to appear, is not the end of the journey. It is only the beginning, but it is a powerful, quiet turning point, a recognition that the healing that was always needed has now begun. And with that realization, there is the possibility of something more, a life where emotional safety can be reclaimed, where connection can be trusted, and where the heart can finally be free. Healing is not a destination. It is not a single moment of triumph, but a continuous, gentle unfolding, a slow, deliberate softening of the heart, a quiet rediscovery of what it means to feel safe. For someone who has grown up without emotional safety, learning to trust again is a process of reconditioning the nervous system, of teaching the body and mind that it is safe to relax, safe to be vulnerable, safe to love and be loved without fear of rejection or abandonment. The first steps are often small, barely noticeable at first. A moment of quiet calm, a breath that is not held in tight anticipation. It may come in the form of a conversation, one that does not end in conflict or emotional withdrawal. It may be the first time someone reaches out, and the instinct is not to retreat, but to lean in. These small moments are the beginning of what feels like something entirely new. It is the first hint of safety, the feeling that the world does not always demand a person to protect themselves, to guard their emotions, to keep themselves small. At first, the person may question these moments. They may doubt their right to feel at ease. The old patterns of hypervigilance, the internalized belief that they are too much, may still rise to the surface. But with each moment of safety, the doubts begin to soften, like a fog slowly lifting. Trusting again is not about erasing the past. It is about understanding that the past no longer has to dictate the present. The walls that were once built for survival, the walls that protected against pain, begin to come down, not because the world is perfect, but because the person begins to see that they can stand without them. They can feel without fear. This process of unlearning, of releasing the old survival patterns, is not linear. It is not immediate. It is not always clear. Some days, the person may feel like they are making great strides, able to connect, able to be present, able to feel safe. Other days, the old patterns may return with force. A sudden flash of anxiety, a fear of rejection, a moment of emotional withdrawal. But the difference now is that the person has begun to understand these moments for what they are, not signals of failure, but remnants of the past. Healing is a practice. It is about choosing again and again to stay in the present, to stay with the discomfort, to stay with the vulnerability. It is about allowing emotions to rise without rushing to suppress them, about learning to sit with the discomfort without fearing that it will overwhelm. And with time, the person begins to notice something subtle but profound. The body feels lighter. The heart feels more open. The breath feels easier. The mind feels less cluttered, less frantic. Emotional safety is not just about feeling free from harm. It is about learning to trust the world, and more importantly, learning to trust oneself. It is about believing that a person is worthy of love, worthy of care, worthy of space to feel and to exist fully. This process, though difficult, is ultimately an act of self-compassion. The person begins to soften toward themselves, to offer the kindness and understanding they may never have received as children. They begin to realize that they do not need to be perfect to be loved, that they do not need to suppress their emotions to keep others close. Relationships, too, begin to change. As the person learns to trust their own emotional needs, they begin to trust others in new ways. They learn to ask for what they need without fear of rejection. They learn to give without expecting to be hurt. They allow themselves to receive love without questioning its worth. It is not that the world becomes perfect. It is not that the person becomes invincible to pain. But there is a shift in perception. Emotional safety, once an elusive concept, becomes a tangible reality, not just in the presence of others, but within the self. Healing is the rediscovery of the soft spaces, the places where it is safe to feel, to be imperfect, to be human. And while the journey is not without setbacks, each step forward brings the person closer to the truth that was always there. They are enough, they are worthy, and it is safe to be exactly who they are. The process of learning safety for the first time is profound because it restores a sense of wholeness, a wholeness that had been lost but never truly gone. It is the quiet revolution of a heart that finally feels at home, not just in the world, but in itself. Healing, when it happens, is not an event of sudden brilliance. It is a quiet, steady process, a soft unfolding, like the first light of dawn breaking the darkness. It is not the loud triumph of overcoming a past. It is the gentle acceptance that the past has shaped, but does not define, the person they have become. As the walls that once guarded the heart begin to fall, there is a softening. Not an erasure of the wounds, but a new relationship to them. The past, which once felt like a weight too heavy to bear, now feels like a part of the story, a chapter in a book that is still being written. The person who has lived for so long in the quiet shadow of their own wounds begins to see something different. They are not broken. They are whole, not despite the pain, but because of it. In this softer ending, there is no rush to fix or move on, because healing is not a line drawn between pain and resolution. It is the continuous act of being present with the hurt, allowing it to speak, to exist, and then gently letting it go, not as a fight, but as a release. The person begins to recognize that their wounds do not make them less worthy of love. They are not defined by the things that were broken, but by the strength it took to carry them. They begin to see themselves as someone who has survived, someone who has learned to grow in the absence of emotional safety, someone who has learned, despite the odds, to feel. Emotional safety is not a place to arrive at, but a space to continuously create. It is not the guarantee that no harm will ever come again, but the understanding that one can endure the hurt and still find the courage to stand. It is the quiet, reassuring knowledge that it is possible to be fully present in one's own life, not as a survivor, but as a participant. There is grace in this realization, that healing does not have to be perfect, that the scars of the past can coexist with the wisdom of the present. The person begins to understand that they do not need to hold their breath in fear of the world, but can instead breathe deeply, trusting in the present moment. They have learned that it is safe to feel fully, to love freely, and to be loved without fear of rejection. In relationships, the shift becomes tangible. The person no longer needs to guard their heart with the same intensity. They are able to show up with their whole self, knowing that vulnerability is not a weakness, but a doorway to deeper connection. They begin to choose relationships that mirror the emotional safety they have learned to create for themselves. They no longer seek the chaos or inconsistency they once knew. Instead, they seek peace, understanding, and a love that is grounded in trust and mutual respect. The journey has not been easy. There have been setbacks, moments of doubt, times when the past threatened to resurface, to demand more attention than it deserved. But with each step forward, the person learns that healing is not linear. It is a dance, a slow waltz of acceptance, of understanding, of integration. And though the wounds of the past may always remain as faint echoes, they no longer define the person. They are part of the story, but not the end. In this softer ending, there is a quiet peace. It is not an absence of pain, but a gentle recognition that pain is a natural part of being human. It is the realization that to be human is to be imperfect, and that imperfections are not to be hidden, but embraced. The journey to emotional safety is long. It is not completed in one moment of awakening, but in 1,000 small, quiet moments where the person chooses to be fully present with their own emotions, to trust themselves, and to trust the world again. In the end, it is not about achieving perfection, but about achieving peace. It is the understanding that emotional safety is not something that is given, but something that is created, and it is always within reach. This is the soft, gentle conclusion. The realization that healing is a process that continues with every breath, with every decision to be open, to be vulnerable, to love. And in this continuous unfolding, there is a quiet kind of strength, a strength that is not born of perfection, but of acceptance. The person has come to understand that their emotional safety is not something that can be granted by others, but something they can create within themselves. And in this creation, there is a deep, abiding peace, a peace that will carry them, not through a world without pain, but through a world where they are finally free to feel all that they are and to trust that it is enough.